Well, welcome everybody. This is season 1, episode 16 of Bridging Generations with Howard Snooks. And I am Howard. And my guest today is named Don Moxley. And we're going to talk about health-related products today as a general topic. But as you know, I always start with a dad joke. So here it is for today. So I ordered a chicken and an egg online. I'll let you know what comes first. Okay, so Don, I'm going to turn the mic over to you here just
Sure.
a little bit. We're, ordinarily this bridging generation things, I'm usually talking with people who are 1, 2, or even maybe 3 generations
Watch it.
younger.
It's getting touchy right now, so be careful. Okay.
But we're not quite. I could be like your younger uncle or
Yeah,
something.
it could
let's
be.
say.
Could be.
Because what's like 13 years difference?
Well, like I
something
said,
that.
we're both in the Social Security range,
Right.
so we're okay.
Okay. Well, I know, and you're not from Colorado. You're from Ohio, and you just flew in today.
Flew in yesterday.
Or
yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah.
And so I've known quite a few of the people I've interviewed, but we just met waiting for this podcast. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you and have you sort of fill in just a little bit about why
Sure.
you're here today.
So to give you a little bit of a background, I am an exercise physiologist and sports scientist. That's what my training is. I've worked as a university professor for 27 years. I left direct teaching back in 2015. I left that to go work at the Ohio State University with the wrestling team as a sports scientist. I was the first paid sports scientist with the wrestling program. I'm an alumnus of Ohio State. I'm an alumnus of Ohio State wrestling. I wrestled back in the early 80s. But we started a program where we used some technology that measures a thing called heart rate variability, which is a stress response metric, and worked on a couple wrestlers, and we earned a national title, and we had a really good run for 4 years. And I got to the point where I was collecting 3.5 million data points a season.
Holy smoke.
On a college wrestling program. And we were able to make training decisions based on the data that we were collecting. Heart rate. If you've never heard of heart rate variability,
fill me in about this.
If you've heard of it and you're not a medical professional, you've probably heard of it with a lot of the wearable technology that's evolving today, like Oura rings and Whoop bands and Garmin watches and Polar watches. Mm-hmm. So this is where it's developing awareness. I learned about heart rate variability, HRV. It's been almost 30 years ago. I was working for a company called Polar Electro. If you probably know Polar from wearing a heart rate monitor, it's a Finnish company, and they had a technology in their device that used HRV to determine training levels. Because as an exercise physiologist, one of the things that's hot in the community right now is VO2, volume of oxygen used when at max. Yeah. And listen, this has been a problem ever since I've been a scientist, is that, to get VO2 max, I've got to put you on a treadmill, wire you up, put a mask on you, and basically run you until you George Jetson off the back of it. And it's a very difficult and intimidating test. And for someone who's trying to integrate fitness and wellness, going to the bone is very difficult to do. And I've always thought and then we'd get that data, and then we'd work backwards from max to determine your ideal training zones. Well, Polar had this technology that you sit for a minute, you stand up for a minute, you walk for a minute, you jog for a minute, you run for a minute. And in that period, as you raise your level of stress, your heart rate variability stabilizes at a point, and what it tells you, it's the bottom of your cardiovascular training zone. And I thought, okay, this is miles better than putting someone on a treadmill.
Those Finns pulled it off again.
Well, and actually HRV comes from the Russians. It was first discovered with Russian cosmonauts.
Oh, wow.
There was in the early 60s, there was a cosmonaut that was struggling, and they detected it with the change in his heart rate. He wound up having an appendicitis. But this one was first discovered. So and again, Russia, Finland, those scientists are right there next to each other. Finland's done a great job of raising the technical application of this, particularly with companies like Polar. So I've been working with it ever since. As a practitioner, I got to the point when someone would come into either my studio or my lab, and I was going to do some type of an assessment or an exercise. I got to the point where I routinely did an HRV study before they started working out. And because I wanted to know what their status was, that Howard, if you walked into my studio tomorrow, yes, we met and had a nice little discussion on a park bench here in Boulder. We're going to have a nice little podcast discussion here, but I really don't know what you've got under your skin. Right. And so for me to bring you into my facility and immediately treat you like everybody else that comes into my facility, that would be malpractice. It just isn't correct. So I got to where I routinely did an HRV study on all of my clients to find out where, and we use a term that's called readiness and resilience. I want to know what your readiness is for this exercise bout I'm getting ready to put you through. And we can determine that with HRV. So this continues to evolve. We do the work at Ohio State. At Ohio State, I got to the point to where I could predict who would be an All-American the first day of the National Wrestling Tournament. In 2018, we sent our whole starting lineup, first time in school history. We had 8 All-Americans, most in school history. But the 2 guys that didn't make it, I knew it the first day of the tournament. A year prior to that, we had started investing. When we figured out that HRV and resiliency is a key performance indicator for wrestling, we started investing in recovery. Like we would use sensory deprivation float tanks. You have them here in Boulder. We floated that team 140 times in one season because we found this to be so important. And that's how we wound up with 8 All-Americans instead of 5 or whatever it was at the time. So it's that process. Listen, I've just been someone who picked up on something a long time ago, recognized its value, and it's grown ever since. And now with the advent of wearable technology, we can now see how HRV, and this is crossing the generations kind of a thing. I can use HRV when I'm working with a young athlete to determine training loads, recovery needs, things like that. I can take that young athlete's parent and we can use HRV to optimize cognitive performance at work. And then finally, what we know is that HRV will work with those of us in what I call the third of life to optimize longevity, particularly health span. So it's a physiological marker that reaches across the generations. That tends to be a very valuable key performance indicator.
So I got a question for you right away.
Okay.
And this has to do with my theme of the bridging generations. Okay. And it's how you have authentic, meaningful interactions,
sure,
relationships, conversations. And you caught my attention. I mean, it was a very interesting, everything you said, but it caught my attention about there was 2 of these guys I knew they weren't going to make it. And I thought, that could be an awkward situation.
It's very awkward.
And could you just talk a little, how do you let these young athletes who have all these dreams and aspirations know, well, yeah, you're going to go somewhere, or, I don't know.
You don't. Okay, far be it from me to piss on someone else's campfire. I am. If someone believes they can do it,
then that means
damn it, I'm getting behind them. But what we've learned, and had I been with the program another year or 2, we would have probably changed some things on selection. That in wrestling, one of the cool things about the sport of wrestling, if you want to be the starter, you've got to go out and beat everybody in your weight class. So you have what's called wrestle-offs, and you go out there and you've got to win the matches, period. It's very rare that the person who wins the wrestle-off isn't the starter. Very rare. For me, back when I was an athlete in 1983, I won my wrestle-offs, but I was not performing well.
Yeah, you mentioned.
And the coach pulled me at the end of the season, put the guy that I'd beaten wrestle-offs in, and he finished out the end of the season. And I was, first of all, it absolutely lit a fire under me. Okay, it was, it was a key positive event in my life because it lit a fire, and I went on to be very successful in the sport, much more successful than I would have had that not happened.
That's very interesting.
So the other side of this is, it's one thing to win one match. Talent, conditioning, technique, those go into that one match. When you go to the national tournament in wrestling, you essentially have to win 5 matches to make All-American. And everybody at nationals is good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're all fit. They're all good technique. It's the top 10% of the sport, and you're trying to get into the top 10% of the sport. And so they're all good. So your ability to recover between events, we now know is a determining factor on your ability to make All-American.
So that's a very interesting fact.
Now, so going back to your question, if I were still with the program, I would be advising the coaching staff that you need to look at your athlete readiness as it relates to selection. So we now have enough data. In 15, we had data on one person. By the end of 16, I had limited studies on a selection of maybe 15 people. In a partnership that Ohio State had with the Air Force Research Lab at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they came to me and they said, listen, we like what you're doing. We want to help you. What do you need? And I said, I need hardware. So I went from 1 collection device to 16 collection devices. Okay. Then you wonder how you get 3.5 million data points. You add more hardware and you start collecting more data. So by 18, this is the first time we're starting to see the impact of having the data and being able to relate it back to performance. But if I were advising the staff today and we had that kind of underlying HRV data on all the athletes, I would tell my athletes that, listen, unless you're able to get your HRV up into we measure it in milliseconds. I said, unless you get above 75 milliseconds, if I've got 2 wrestlers that are close and I've got one with 100 milliseconds of recovery and I've got one with 30, I have to go with the one with 100 based on what we know now.
So, okay, so that answers one of my questions. I was thinking, did you have information about these athletes that they didn't know about themselves?
They had it all. We weren't. It wasn't until, listen, 18 was the last year I was there. Uh-huh. That was the year we made this observation with the 10 and the 8 and the 2.
Yeah.
And so that's what we learned from that. Okay, you learn from every observation
Absolutely.
You make. So that's what we learned from that. So the athletes knew the information, they knew the data. Not only did they not understand the impact of it, we were just learning it.
Sure.
So, that's what we learned back then.
Beta testing.
Listen, life is a beta test. And one of the challenges that we deal with now is that our data sets, we have conditioned the general public to think randomized controlled studies that get published in peer-reviewed journals are the only evidence that we have. We have more than that. With wearable data and with the wearable devices and the amount of data that they're creating, we have a whole new mechanism for evidence. And I think this is important. I think it's important for the healthcare and sport performance community to begin thinking about changing to, okay, what is this N of 1 data that we have? I think we need to develop we need to apply some new statistical tools to analyzing this. Because, when you're working with elite populations, if you're in a random controlled trial, mm-hmm. we spend an inordinate amount of time normalizing our study population so that our study population looks like their general public. Well, when you're working with a group of elite college wrestlers, they're a full 2 standard deviations to the right of the mean.
Yep.
I mean, this is an elite group. And by the way, I'm not doing random controlled studies with my wrestlers. Okay. I'm not pulling half of them out and creating a placebo.
Right.
We're in a performance mode. I'm giving them the best gas I've got. But we can do analysis. This is what we learn. We can start to do, there's a thing that's called Bayesian statistical analysis that I'm just learning about. Because this is what I see, when you're working with like a CDC or a big population control group, use standard population statistics. That's great. Okay. But when you start to work with individuals, and you know this as a practitioner, that person sits down in front of you. They could be 3 standard deviations to the right of mean or 3 standard deviations to the left on a particular element. Your job as a practitioner is to figure this out. And that's what mine is. And this is where HRV winds up being such a great tool for us.
Well, so, okay, let's talk about this recovery rate, because that sounds, like it means a whole lot.
It means a great deal.
And I'm curious about how you let's see, there's a genetic component to it.
Yep.
There's a developmental component
Yep.
to it. There's
Environmental.
a state of the mind that day component to it. So how does a person improve that recovery rate? What have you learned about
Well, if what is it? I'm trying to remember who said this. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you start measuring it. I believe HRV within a decade will be a major key performance piece for not just medicine, but also sport. Not just sport, but also medicine. Right now, I'll walk into my physician's office and they will weigh me. They will put me in a room. They'll take my blood pressure. We'll be looking at labs that we might have had drawn 3 to 6 to a year before, months before. But I have this portfolio of daily data, either from my wearable or a ring, from my heart rate monitor, from my continuous glucose monitor. I have physiological data that is just incredibly beneficial. But we haven't trained our professionals on how to use it.
Yeah.
And by the way, stepping on the scale, that's a valueless measurement. Valueless. Blood pressure, borderline valueless because of white coat syndrome.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
mine's always up a few points.
Yeah, it's always so that and if you're up, what's the first thing they say? Go measure this at home and let us know. Okay. So all of a sudden we're throwing away the measurement that we make in the clinic in order to get the right data. So this wearable home data, and we now have some really cool technology for measuring these things. Well, this can apply across the generations, from a young athlete to a business executive. If you're a trial attorney, if you're a Wall Street broker, if you're someone who goes into one of these really high stress, high risk jobs, what's the difference between that and wrestling the nationals? They're very similar. And so we can use tools. Now here's the challenge. And I don't know what it was like when you were in school, but we had a pretty healthy social life. We enjoyed ourselves. And we drank a lot. Shocker, a college athlete that drank a lot. But
Boone's Farm apple wine.
I may have tasted that. But
Mateus, if you had a nice day, Mateus is what you mentioned.
Well, anyway, we thought, and back in the 80s, working harder than your opponent was a strategy for success. We didn't know the value of recovery necessarily. And what we know, when you start measuring HRV, it will probably change your alcohol consumption because when you see, we did a study with the team back in 2016. We did an overnight study with an athlete that had consumed no alcohol. We took that same athlete the next day and had them drink 4 beers before going to bed. It essentially cut their recovery that night in half. They still slept for 8 hours, but the body was processing the alcohol for close to 4 hours, and they didn't drop into what we call parasympathetic state, that recovery state, for nearly 4 hours.
Interesting.
Now, that's great data. You know what? We saw this. I have a team meeting. We put this up. I believe it changed some behaviors. So these are the things. And if you're a Wall Street broker or a prosecuting attorney or something like that, and you're finishing up work and you're going back and throwing back a couple bourbons, and you've got to go again the next day, you might want to think about that. Here's some evidence that says, let's pay attention to this. If you're that person's parent and you're the grandparent now, and my mom and dad, we lost my dad about 20 years ago. We lost my mom 5 years ago. And before we lost them both, they moved from Ohio out into Sun City, Arizona.
Oh, yeah.
In the wintertime for retirement.
My parents moved to Arizona too.
Yes, yes. And so my wife and I and my daughter fly out to see grandma and grandpa. And my parents were teetotalers growing up. They did not drink. Every once in a while, my dad would have a bottle of Mogan David and he'd go out and burn brush, but that was Mogan David.
Blackberry wine?
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't recognize it. But we always knew when dad was going out to burn brush at night. And that was a monthly event maybe. But we go out to Arizona to see my mom and dad, and we're like, hey, we're going to run over to the grocery store. What do you want us to get? And they're like, get a handle of vodka and some peach schnapps. And I'm like, what? Well, they're rolling through vodka and peach schnapps like you would not believe. And I'm like, wow. And I stopped by and I thought, well, so what's the problem with this? They're retired. They're loving life. Who am I to judge? Well, this mom and dad live good, long lives. But processing alcohol is brutal.
So you've really learned something about alcohol here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
Well, and let me give the other half of that story.
Okay.
Let's talk about alcohol and cannabis. So while I'm at Ohio State, I started getting calls from some pro guys because of our relationship with the Air Force Research Lab, and they were working with multiple high-level sports organizations and high-level military, SEALs, Delta Force, people like that. We're sharing data, we're sharing information, and a couple of these pro guys reach out to me and they're like, hey, what do you know about cannabis and HRV? And I said, I don't know anything about it. My guys are NCAA athletes. We're still testing for this. And they said, well, we're seeing some things that some guys have responded well. And when I asked them what they did, they told me the truth. And they said they were smoking pot. And I go, interesting. Well, from a previous work I'd done, I worked for a company out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a wearable company using HRV. And I exited that company to go back to the university. And one of my buddies there went into cannabis up in Oregon. And he would send me notes. Hey, what do you know about this? What do you know about that? And he'd send me papers that had popped up. And what's interesting about cannabis is that there is a tremendous amount of research that has been done, particularly by the Israelis, usually using American dollars. But there is a portfolio of research that's very good. Well, my buddy reaches out to me and says, hey, how would you like to work in cannabis? And it gives me the proverbial offer you can't refuse. So he offers me a job to do medical brand building down in Florida in this cannabis brand. So I take the offer, triple what I was making at Ohio State, and begin an intense learning experience. That you pierce the veil and all of a sudden you see all this information that I had not seen prior. I learned about a thing called the endocannabinoid system. Are you familiar with this?
This I am somewhat familiar
but
with.
Probably because you're a Coloradian, not because of your academic training.
Right.
Okay. I don't think this is in the academic textbooks yet. Well, when you look at the endocannabinoid system, it's a critical nervous system that's used to regulate stress response. It's driven by what's called the vagal nerve. The vagal nerve is the key pathway to that. So we'll continue talking about this. But so I go down to cannabis and I start learning. Most of your listeners, if they're Boulder residents or Coloradians, they've heard of the runner's high. That sense of euphoria that comes from exercise. That's not dopamine. That's anandamide. It's what's called an endocannabinoid that your body produces when you exercise. Oh, by the way, many of the cannabis cannabinoids land on the same receptors that endocannabinoid. I'm not talking about the THC, CB1s, but I'm talking about the CB2s and some of the lower level CB1s. And so this is information. I've been teaching exercise physiology for 30 years, and I've never heard of this. And it directly impacts what we're talking about. So I'm down in Florida and I'm like, okay, I need to understand this. I need to see this. Howard, I don't know where you're at, but I don't believe in in accidents. I think things happen for a reason. I think there's a reason why I was living in Florida. I laugh. I was sitting down there. My wife and daughter were still back in Ohio. I'm living in this 1-bedroom apartment down in North Palm Beach, kind of bumming one day. And I go, how do I go from this really cool job at Ohio State when I'm working with Olympians to selling weed in South Florida? I go, how's that happen? And I took a step back. I said, okay, quit judging yourself so harshly. But I came up with a personal mission at the time. I said, how does this fit? And I developed a personal mission of, I help individuals understand the changes necessary to alleviate suffering and contribute to the betterment of well people. Because what we know is that the continuum that is the vagus nerve and HRV is a continuum from trauma to elite performance. And the same techniques that move the elite performers move the folks that have had to deal with trauma. And I don't need to tell you the role of trauma in our society. It's significant. I can see trauma in my athletes. These are what we're starting to be able to see. And in the same way, I shouldn't treat you the same way I treat one of my athletes that walk into my clinic. I shouldn't treat two athletes the same, because we don't know what their trauma portfolio is coming through the door. And you have to recognize that because it affects recovery and it affects resiliency. So these are key points. So I work in Florida. I start to learn about some of the other cannabinoids besides THC, particularly CBDA and some of the terpenes that come with this. I create some what we call tinctures, where you take some of those molecules, you put it usually in a coconut oil. And at the time, my older brother was struggling with an autoimmune disease, something between MS and Lou Gehrig's. He was a doctor of veterinary medicine, a very talented doctor, and he was starting to lose function. And so he was down in Florida, and I was talking to him, I'm not enough of a neurologist to really understand what's going on there. But as he described it, I said, I believe your endocannabinoid system could be being affected by what you're dealing with. So let's go ahead and put these molecules on board. And so he did. In tincture form. And probably 6 months later, he came to me, he says, I have to tell you something. He says, I am getting more relief from what you do than everything else I'm getting from the other medical professionals. And I thought, well, we lost him 4 years ago. He got COVID. He was one of the COVID victims. And I had moved to another company. I'd moved to a company called Longevity Labs that's based down in Denver. It's an Austrian company that we opened the U.S. office down in Denver. And we sold a product that was called Spermidine Life. So Spermidine.
It's an evocative name.
Yeah, it is, and everybody has the same reaction. So as the director of branding, I had to learn to reverse that. So Spermidine is a very small molecule called a polyamine. So if you think of an amino acid, this is a string of carbons. It's a carbon backbone with some nitrogens in there with an acid, a carboxyl group attached. That's what an amino acid is. Well, if you take that carboxyl group off and you just have the carbon background and the nitrogens, you have an amine. That's what that is. So a polyamine. So there's 3 nitrogens, so it's many amines. And what we learned from the research on Spermidine is that it's critical in the methylation of a pathway that leads to autophagy production in the cell. And
eating something.
Self-eating. So this is the reason you fast. When you fast, you lower the amount of nutrients in the bloodstream. The cell recognizes that and says, hey, let's go ahead and clean house. Let's get the stuff out of the cells that we don't need. And by the way, fasting and autophagy are absolute drivers of health span, lifespan. So we start to spin this company up. And so I had to learn to do in about 2 sentences to counter the thought that went through your head when I said Spermidine. So we got that done. And we start growing this company. And actually a Boulder physician, a good friend of our company's, Dr. Elizabeth Yurth at the Boulder Longevity Institute here, she was on a podcast with a guy by the name of Dave Asprey, big biohacking guy. Well, this blew our company up. This podcast posts and we explode. And I was sitting with my partners and I said, listen, I'm really glad we're doing well, but we need to understand why people are buying our product other than Dave said so. So in the process, in the marketing process, after you bought the product, you got an invitation to have a phone call with me for 15 minutes to talk about what do you want to know about Spermidine? Can we ask you a few questions, kind of a thing. So I wound up speaking to probably 400 or 500 of our first 1,000 clients. Ironically, Dave Asprey at the time was on the advisory board for Aura, the ring that measures HRV. Mm-hmm. And 80% of the people I spoke to had Aura rings. 80% of them didn't know what to do with them. Hmm. And I went to I said, listen, there's an opportunity here. And so our CEO, Daniel Dietz, said to me, he says, can we make an HRV supplement? And I said, I've already done it. I said, because Daniel and I worked together in Florida. That's how we wound up in Colorado together. I said, I've already done it. I said, I've already developed the tincture. We've already done it. Now we modified the formulation and I added what's called specialized pro-resolving mediators to it, SPMs. And what those are, your audience probably understands what omega-3 fats are. These are the fats that come from like good fatty fish. These are the really good healthy fats that we want in our diet. Yes, exactly. So and the way it works is, so when a cell is assaulted, it begins a process of protection. The first step in that process is inflammation. And it takes omega-6 fats. They go through this Cox-Lox enzymatic pathway, and they become inflammatory markers and cause inflammation. Well, inflammation, not inflation, inflammation. At the same time, the omega-3s go through the same pathways, and they produce what's called pro-resolving mediators. These are the things that clean the inflammation out of the cell. Now, the problem is now when someone has an assault to a cell and there's pain, we take ibuprofen or we take an NSAID, which blocks COX-2, not only on the omega-6s, but also on the omega-3s. Mm-hmm. So there's a great researcher in Portugal that developed an enzymatic process for spinning SPMs out of omega-3 sardines, and we could buy them. So we went and got that. We got that omega-3 fats from Portugal. We combined that with the cannabis combination that we have of CBDA, particularly beta-caryophyllene and some other terpenes. And that's what made a product that's called Mode Method. And that's what brought me to you today, is that this is a dietary supplement that combines those two things. We did a quick little study on it. You know, this isn't science. This is alchemy. This is taking known elements and just combining them together. We got some great results, and we've been rolling with the product now for about 5 years.
Well, so you've got quite a trajectory here in your employment history.
That's an interesting term.
And because of my theme, I want to bring that back. This is very interesting and useful information for the people that are reading. But I wanted to get your more personal story too a little bit. Mm-hmm. You told me that you grew up on a farm in eastern Ohio.
Yep.
And you thought, you know, after you went away to college, you would go back and you'd run that farm.
I love raising critters, no doubt.
It didn't happen.
No.
Wrestling, somehow it really got...
No, there were two things. Okay. Number one was an ag econ class as a freshman. And so this is the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. If you don't inherit your farm, you can't make money. Right. Period. Okay. It's hard to make money anyway. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to lose it. But if you don't inherit your farm, and our farm, we leased old reclaimed strip mine ground. We lived in the middle of all those strip pits over in eastern Ohio, and we leased those. And it was, and economically it worked out. But I looked at that and I said, you know what? That's not going to work for a lifetime.
I got a joke for you.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt,
but
right. This is the perfect time.
Yeah.
So this old farmer, he won the lottery, $3 million. And this was back early when $3 million meant something.
Right.
And so he got interviewed by this radio announcer. He says, well, so Luke, what are you going to do with that $3 million? And he says, I'm just going to keep farming until the money's all gone.
Yeah.
You know, my parents both were raised on ranches.
Sure.
And my dad and mom did have a chance to inherit my dad's parents' ranch, which had first been owned by his great-great-grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they wanted to modernize their lives, they decided. And they also thought, well, you know, like they didn't really have a great go at this. It was a beautiful place, but it, like you said, there's just so
very Yellowstone-ish. Yep, I get it.
Depression era, you know, the whole thing. So they decided, well, you know, if they can't really make a living, I don't know why they think we can. So they decided to go. We were the city cousins. We lived in a small town.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to just
so yeah, it's a challenge. It's hard. So first of all, I sit through that. My sophomore year, so I was a wrestler. So I'm the smallest in my family. In high school, I would cut to 175.
Wow.
And I was smaller than my mother. Okay, I was the smallest person in the family.
Wow.
I have a younger brother that's 6'9".
6'9"?
Yeah, and played football at Ohio State, played for the Washington Redskins, probably a biscuit over, you know, back in, you know, the 320s back then. So, and we were all wrestlers. I grew up in a house, an old farmhouse that in the wintertime, the water would freeze. And if I didn't wrestle, I didn't have a warm shower that day. So there might have been, you know, other driving factors as to why we did it, but you learn resilience. You learn to deal with that. So we go to Ohio State. I decided to stop cutting weight because my freshman year I cut from about 220 to 177. Practiced.
That's 40 some pounds.
Yeah. It was a lot. Practiced 15 days, hurt a knee, had surgery on it, was basically done for the season. Came back as a sophomore. We had a returning All-American at 77. So I thought, okay, I'll move up to 190. Cut from about 230 to 190. Again, another about a 40-pound cut. Did twice as well that year. Practiced 30 days, hurt the other knee, had surgery on it. And I'm like, okay, what do I have to do? And so at the time, I went to people that answer this question. They said, you got to get stronger. Because I was not a weightlifter back then. If you lifted, you gained weight and it was harder to cut. And so you just didn't do it. I didn't do it. Started lifting weights, became a heavyweight, and started to become successful.
Interesting.
And so that's when I fell in love with physiology, of not just the short-term strength training, but sprint training, endurance training, all the elements of physiology. One of the great things about Ohio State is that we have both a medical school and a vet school. And many of our courses are co-numbered. Now, the challenge I had that I didn't make this decision until my third season. And the Big Ten at the time had a rule called normal progress that every quarter, we were on quarters back then, every quarter, the dean of your college signed off on your schedule and says you're on normal progress to graduate in 5 years. So if you change your major after your third year, you're ineligible.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, you don't go from animal science to pre-vet to pre-med or something like that. You just don't do it. So, but because of the co-numbering, I was able to pull in human physiology courses to meet the demands of my animal science degree.
Very clever.
And then so essentially I was 5 years undergraduate. I did essentially half of my graduate work my fifth year, and then did my graduate where I finished my graduate degree in exercise phys in a year, in 3 quarters after that, because I'd done most of it. So, and by that time I was full on human performance. So that was the interesting time of how you transition from, you know, a farm kid. You know, everybody, when you shake my hand, everybody's like, man, look at those hands. I'm like, those are old hay baling hands.
Yeah.
So,
well, you're a husky guy.
Yeah, sure. I can. Some people have called me thick, but I'm not sure they were talking about my body shape.
THICC. That's how they spell that.
Yeah.
Well, so who along the way, can you think of some people who helped guide you in your trajectory?
No doubt. At the physiology level, I had 3 mentors that were incredibly beneficial, 3 or 4. Number one was a professor by the name of Dr. Robert Bartels. Dr. Bob was really interesting. He swam at Ohio State back in the late 50s. And Ohio State used to have a renowned swimming and diving program. In fact, in the 62 Olympics, multiple people on that team were Ohio State
wow.
State athletes. So, and he was part of helping them. And Dr. Bartels, I sat in his class. I remember this like it was yesterday. I was sitting in his class, my fourth year, my academic senior year. And I had written a paper on training and conditioning for wrestling. You know, I was pretty focused. And I remember him walking me through some key elements of this and what understanding, in particular, understanding energy system production in the human body. This was a foundational piece for me, understanding. And if you're a young athlete or if you're a young professional and you want to grow, you can't move forward without understanding energy production methods.
Well, you had a real hunger for going beneath the surface. I can tell.
That's me.
Yeah.
I tend to
you
not
didn't
stop.
Just go, oh, this is cool. You go, what is that all about?
Yeah. Well, and understand it at a deep level.
Yeah.
Well, and if we take this up until your generations, one of the things we struggle with the most in our third of our life is dealing with energy, and in particular, the impact of reactive oxygen species and what goes with that. Yeah. Well, that is a core element of what's called the electron transport system in the mitochondria of the cell, which is where we get energy from. So the same way I'm considering whether an athlete is using a supplement like creatine to supplement their phosphocreatine system, or we've way overprescribed glucose in the glycolytic pathways, but when you get into the oxidative pathways and understanding those, particularly as they work through the electron transport system, they're critical. So Dr. Bartels gets that. Secondly, I had a teammate. He's my brother at this point. His name was David Ruckman, and David was a Big Ten champion in 1983. First one in 10 years at Ohio State. My friend Jim Humphreys, I believe, was in 73, and then David in 83. And then I was able to win a Big Ten title in 85.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was interesting. But David had a roommate. His name was Kevin Akins. Kevin at the time was a shot putter on not only the Ohio State team, but also the U.S. national team. And he threw for a thing called Santa Monica Track Club and Nike Track Club. And I'm over at their apartment one night, and we're talking about getting strong and so forth. And Kevin says, you want to get strong? I'll take you and show you where to get strong. So he takes me to this place, this guy. It eventually became called Westside Barbell. Literally 10 of the strongest people in the world, all countries, come to train there. And I go there the first time, and here are 5 guys cycling through doing 1,000-pound squats for doubles. And I'm like, well, we are not in Kansas anymore. But when we start to take a look at what I learned there, this was another key element. This was the elite of the elite in strength.
And it's sort of secret in a way.
It was in Columbus.
Yeah.
Columbus has an interesting background when it comes to strength and conditioning. The first time, the Russian, if you study any strength, you've seen a guy named Vasiliev Alexiev. He big pot belly, wore a wrestling, and first time he ever took 500 pounds over his head was in Columbus, Ohio. They have there's a big event there called the Arnold Classic, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Classic. Schwarzenegger won the Olympia in Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, interesting.
And there's places around town that you can find these barbells and so forth. But yeah, so Westside was a big part of that. And then we had a strength coach at Ohio State. His name was Steve Bliss. Steve had studied out at Nebraska. Literally, the first college strength coach ever was at the University of Nebraska. Steve studied under him. Steve wound up at Ohio State, but he had an intern there by the name of Ted Lambrinides. Ted was an absolute mentor of mine. Steve and Ted. I mean, I've got to give, and I'll talk more about Steve here in a minute. But if you've studied strength and conditioning at all, if you've looked at it, back in the late 70s and early 80s, we had a thing called Nautilus, and there were Nautilus centers. And if you know the Nautilus, it was named after this curve.
Silver Nautilus machine.
Absolutely. So Dr. Jones was, I'll think about his first name here in a minute. But so Jones, his son, Greg Jones, had identified that on leverage equipment, on equipment where you hung a weight on a arm, that created a force curve as well, much like the Nautilus curve. Well, they had a company down in Cincinnati that was called Nautilus Leverage, which eventually became Hammer Strength. And you see Hammer Strength in all the gyms now. It's all part of the Life Fitness brand. So Ted and we plugged in to the to the Cincinnati Bengals strength coach, the University of Penn State strength coach, the Washington Redskins strength coach. So this was kind of a gathering of early enthusiasts and experts in that space. So the combination of working with having Dr. Bartels guide me through a good physiological understanding of energy systems, which has been critical. I use it today with new science. It's how you analyze things today. Combine that with some training techniques that were way out on the edge from Lou at Westside Barbell, and then going back to the Nautilus leverage, the Ted Lambrinides kind of a stuff. It was a great opportunity.
I love this story.
Thank you.
I have a personal trainer, Dan Greenbaum. I've worked with him for 13 years, and he's not a physiologist by training, but he is getting a master's degree in something related. But he is a very knowledgeable guy, and he's going to love this story because part of it is the history of strength conditioning. Like you knew the guys back when,
we knew. Again, I'm old enough to have known them.
Yeah. So that is really cool. I think that's really.
Yeah, it's been fun. When I taught university for 27 years. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing, listen, if you want to learn something, learn to teach it. And that was a blessing that, a friend of mine, we'd finished up my undergraduate work. I was running a health club up in Northern Columbus. And actually what happened is Steve Bliss, he did two things. Steve did two things. One, this is back before we had the huge money in the athletic departments, and Steve needed help in the weight room. You bring an entire football team into a weight room, one guy can't run that. Mm-hmm. So he needed interns. So Steve went around to the College of Physical Education, Dr. Bartels and Dr. Brian Mann, and they developed a master's degree it was an exercise phys subcategory called strength and conditioning. And so it was a scholarship for grad school. I ran the weight room in a local high school. The local high school paid for part of my education. Part of it came from the School of Physiologist. But essentially I had a full ride in grad school because of the work that Steve Bliss did. And I am eternally grateful for that because my college roommate was the head strength coach for the Cincinnati Bengals for 30 years. That I have friends from that program, Michigan State, Minnesota, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Indianapolis Colts. They were all there. And now Mickey Marotti, who is now the strength coach at Ohio State, he's the vice president, I'm going to mess up his title, but he's the athletic director in charge of athlete performance. Mickey came through the program the year after. He's done amazing work in understanding and developing tools for athletes to develop. So it was a blessing to be part of that.
Well, I understand now why what you said earlier about how things don't just happen, but they're sort of meant to be, that you're.
I believe the universe exerts forces.
Yeah, I can see why you do.
I don't know about you, but Howard, there's some times when all of a sudden a book winds up in my lap. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how it got there, but when I read it, I am incredibly blessed that it was there because it was the exact right thing at the right time. So who am I to judge? I just let it happen.
Well, we have to close here. But I have one question to ask you first. It's about creatine. Tell me about creatine. This is the one supplement that I take.
Oh, creatine's it's the most studied supplement on the market.
Right.
The data is very clear. It's very productive. That one of your energy systems is labeled ATP-PC. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the actual. That's the volt that gives the energy, but it comes from a thing called creatine phosphate, phosphorylated creatine. Well, creatine's a key element of that. So when you supplement it, you raise the creatine stores not only in the muscle, but also in the brain. The creatine crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Right, I heard that.
Probably need to be taking it at more than 10 grams a day. But there's lots of great information out there. And so I believe we've way over supplemented glucose. We're using way too much of it. Creatine is a wonderful supplement. And then on the other end of the continuum, on the oxidative end, we have a thing that's called ketone esters. Mm-hmm. So ketone esters can be phenomenal tools for performance at all levels. So a good friend of mine, Frank Yost, has a company called Ketonaid. And you can go to my website. If you go to my website, trainrecoverwin.com, I have a recommended products page there. You can go see. But yeah, so those two are amazing products, particularly in cognitive performance, particularly in cognitive rehab. If you're struggling to get 2 and 2, I really like supplementing NAD precursors, NMN. I don't like supplementing NAD. I like supplementing NMN or NR. But that's another podcast.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So, I hope fitness nerds were listening to this because, and I mean that in the very best way. That you really...
Well, I hope it's performance nerds. I hope it's again, third. Are you learning? Are you earning and supporting others, or are you living your best life? In your third. Because if you're doing that, listen. Biology is undefeated. We're all going somewhere, sometime. I want to make sure that, I watched my brother pass, and my father and my brother, and they had bad endings, in hospitals, on tubes for a long time. I don't want anything to do with that. And if my passing is either running the edge of the Grand Canyon and slipping and enjoying the ride down, I want to be someplace beautiful. I want to have told my wife I love her and move on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
You do have a big hand.
I have a paw.